Today, we continue our exploration of the concept of happiness, what it really means, and how it influences our lives and businesses in ways we may never have considered. Joining me is Peter Teuscher, an executive coach, leadership consultant, and author of the book Rethinking Happiness. Peter's approach to happiness is fresh and practical. He's all about redefining this elusive feeling as something rooted in our own choices and beliefs, rather than in our accomplishments and professions. Today, he'll guide us through why so many of us misunderstand happiness, the feedback our emotions give us, and how to break free from habits and beliefs that hold us back. Peter shares his personal journey from feeling lost in what appeared to be a dream life to rethinking his own happiness and ultimately finding his path to fulfillment. If you've ever felt like happiness is just out of reach, or if you're ready to take a closer look at the beliefs shaping your life, you're going to really appreciate Peter's insights. Let's jump in with Peter Teuscher. Thanks for listening to the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Hey, Peter, thanks for joining us. Great to see you here on the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast.
It's great to be with you, Alex. Appreciate it.
You wrote a book earlier this year called Rethinking Happiness, and I thought we might start there just to understand a little bit about that work and what you meant by it. It's a really fresh take on how we define happiness, and I'd like to hear a little bit about your personal experiences and how that kind of shaped the way that you approach this topic, if you will. And I'll tell you another thing that popped to mind was, when I saw the title Rethinking Happiness, I thought to myself, well, hang on, isn't happiness something that I'm experiencing? Like, in what way do I need to actually be in my mind when I'm thinking about happiness versus not? But anyway, give us the lowdown on the book and how you came to create this.
Yeah, I guess first off with the title and rethinking, you're right. I mean, the idea is to get more out of your head than in it to be happier. But I think it was one of the important things I like to talk about in the book is definitions and redefining the way we think about things and the way we talk about things. So that's where the whole idea of rethinking happiness, because a lot of people have this idea about what happiness is. It's usually something that, our culture tells us about, society tells us about, or our family or whatever. And so to have another closer look at that and to define it for ourselves. But you're right. Obviously, it's in the moment. Happiness. We can get into it in more depth. My definition, but that was kind of the idea of the book. And the book I really approach in the same way I approach my coaching. I have ideas from different perspectives that I put out there, and then at the end of each chapter, I ask several questions to get people to request and to reflect. And I mean, you're all about raising consciousness, right? Being conscious entrepreneur. And for me, one of my coaching mottos is awareness allows change. And that's all about bringing things to the level of consciousness that we're aware of them. And so the book really, the way I came from being in a really bad place to living a very happy life was by fundamentally changing my beliefs and the sort of chronic or habitual thoughts that I had. And that's really what's behind the book. Happiness is a major component. And a lot of it is really about changing the way we believe and think habitually.
So what are the misconceptions that people have about happiness? Like what are we generally speaking getting wrong? Some of the things that I think of when I think about this are, obvious ones to me are, well, we're too focused on, what other people think of us, or we're too focused on the material world, or sort of equating stuff with happiness. That's one. Another thing that I can think of that I've chatted with some other folks on this podcast about is the tyranny of this if-then thinking, meaning I'll be happy when such and such a thing happens in my life, as opposed to being happy now. But walk us through what are the things that you saw people, or what you see people kind of get wrong or misconceive about what happiness means versus what it actually is.
Yeah, you're right. The most common one is people make happiness this destination, this place that if I do all of these things, I'll eventually get to happiness. And obviously that anybody has these big milestones, especially really ambitious people who, are constantly on the go, they'll get somewhere, achieve a milestone, and then it's on to the next thing. So they're not even enjoying it. So this idea that happiness is something that you'll have when you achieve these things. Obviously that's not right. And another misconception a lot of people have is that happiness, I need to create all the right conditions to be happy. Otherwise, it's never going to work. So, I have to have the right relationship. I have to have the right job. I have to have, and that's a bit of an if then as well, but it's just creating conditions. And really the only conditions you need to create are those internal ones. So I think that's where I like to, and even the way I define happiness, I really look at it as happiness is this feedback that we're getting, both in terms of the way we're living our lives, the actions we're taking and the choices we're making, and also how we're looking at the world, the perceptions we have. So both of those things, for a lot of people, especially for someone like myself who has a long time ago dealt with depression, it's hard to, even no matter how good your life is, it's really hard to see the positives from that perspective. And so happiness for me is that feedback that either the way I'm thinking about the world or the actions and choices that I'm making are really the not on track or not in alignment with my values or the needs that I have. And when we live in contrast with those, the feedback we're getting is that we're unhappy. And so when we are feeling happy, we know we're in alignment with, our inner guidance system, or we are seeing the world in a way that's positive for us. So that points to sort of my definition of happiness.
Help me understand this thing about feedback in a little bit more detail.
Yeah. So with anything, I think feelings are a communication, right? So when we stub our toe, we get that shot of pain. That's feedback that something's gone wrong. And the same thing is true emotionally. So we have this inner emotional guidance system that will, whether you call it your intuition or, your instincts, when you have certain outcomes, you'll feel emotions, disappointment or happiness or joy or satisfaction. And that's the other thing about, happiness and why it's important for each person to define it for themselves, because some people will call it fulfillment. Some people will call it achievement, satisfaction. I even had one person that I asked, how do you define success? And he said to me, happiness, right? So each person defines that for themselves. But this feedback is really, I look at everything systemically. My training is as a systemic coach, which means I take a holistic view and I look at all the different kind of contributing factors. And so when you see happiness as feedback, that's in this moment, how am I feeling? And if I have what I call, or how I define happiness, then I know I've made the right choices, or I'm seeing the world in a way that fulfills me, right? So it's this combination, it's this sort of systemic way of looking at, the choices I'm making, the thoughts I'm thinking, and then how's that coming back to me? How's that feeding back to me in life? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does. And so it's, the feedback system is about recognizing how I'm feeling or understanding, how I'm reacting to whatever therefore is around me, right?
Absolutely. And so because happiness is an inside job, and I think this is a big lesson when I backpacked through Asia and I met these people who, on the standards that people in the West have, they had very little, or they had almost nothing, and yet they seemed very happy. They were, a level of happiness that I'd not seen in around my friends that I'd grown up with in a lot of ways. And so it really helped reinforce this idea that it's really this, this inner process, this inner way of processing your life and the things that happen to you and the experiences that you have.
So much of happiness, really comes down to the beliefs that we hold about ourselves and about the world. And I know that that's been quite a lot of your work around those beliefs. How are we thinking about that? How do we challenge or question the beliefs that we have about our life and about happiness? Are there reframes that we need to be thinking of if we want to be happier, or sort of go down that path to be more aware? Like, what role are beliefs playing here?
I mean, that's a really tough one for a lot of people to grasp, that you can just change your beliefs if you want to. You can choose your beliefs, because people think, well, no, this is something I've carried with me for a long time. It's come from my experiences. I know this to be true, or I'm convinced that this is true, and so it becomes part of their identity. And changing your identity is a very overwhelming thing. I look at sort of three ways that people develop their beliefs, and beliefs are something that we, from the time we were old enough to think, we were starting to create these beliefs about ourselves and the world and our place in it. And so we've carried these with us for a long time. And just like any habit, it takes time to change these things. But the way I look at, I first look at where beliefs come from to give people a solution for how we can then change those beliefs. So I talked about experiences. Our experiences lead to certain beliefs about the world. Those beliefs will lead to strategies in terms of how we live our life and how we deal with certain situations. The other is our environment. So the influences from around us, it's the media, it's our family, it's our culture. And then the third one that I look at is our repetitive thought. So, you can convince yourself of just about anything if you think it often enough, or if you hear it often enough. And so these repetitive thoughts really then turn into these beliefs. So if you're then looking at how do I change my beliefs, if it's something that you've experienced, then it's creating a new experience for yourself. If you had a bad experience with public speaking and therefore you're afraid of it, then starting with a small group and a bigger group and so on. So just having a new experience. When it comes to your environment, one of the things I mentioned backpacking through Asia, I noticed a big difference. I didn't watch the news, or I didn't read any news while I was traveling for those 6 months. And naturally, not going to work, not having stress has probably helped as well. But I stayed in that habit of reducing the amount of negative input that I had. And it's a big part of what keeps me in a positive mindset. I notice in myself, and I did this during COVID, you're constantly on the watching the news. And I realized, wow, I'm just taking way too much of this in. And then as soon as I sort of reduced it and got the amount of information I needed, but then, rationed it a bit, I felt better. So this input you're getting from the outside world, this influence from your environment. And then the third thing, when we recognize we are having these chronic negative thoughts, I use affirmations. And I used to think affirmations, that's kind of a woo-woo thing, or, I didn't really take it that seriously until I started using it for myself. And so the way I use affirmations is, I recognize a thought, or sort of a category of thoughts that I recognize keep coming up for me in a negative way. And I make a statement that's the opposite. And the important thing, it needs to be believable to me. I say it as if it was already true in the present moment. And so when these negative thoughts come up, I have my statement ready, and then the thoughts will become less and less. When they come up again, I've got my statement ready, I apply it again, and over time, it fades away to nothingness. And so I explain to clients sometimes, it's in terms of breaking these neural pathways that are your thoughts and memories and so on. It's kind of like walking through the forest. There may be a path there, but if you want to go on a new path, it'll take some time to walk that in. And then if you continue to walk that path, the other path will grow over. And so the same with those connections in your brain, in terms of you have those stronger connections to those new thoughts. And if they're positive, that will get you on track, and it'll get you away from sort of those beliefs that those negative thoughts have established in yourself.
For a lot of people, the beliefs are such a big deal that they're totally intertwined with their identity, right?
Yeah.
Or like, I'm thinking back to my conversation on this podcast with Dr. Srikumar Rao, which was a while ago. But he talks a lot about mental models, right? So I have a mental model of how the world should work. I have a mental model of how I should be. I have a mental model of how the world needs to react to me, and all this sort of stuff. And the trick with beliefs is sometimes they're so deep in there, I don't even see them as beliefs. I don't question them. Or like you were implying earlier, like maybe I don't even want to give them away. I don't want to let go of these beliefs because I'm just too used to it. And the opposite of that belief, even if it's true, may just cause me too much stress, and I just don't feel like having that level of self-investigation, type of thing. And so sometimes people simply say, "Hey, I don't, whatever it is, I'm simply unwilling to go there." But what you're saying is, if we really look at this stuff, we can train ourselves to have the right thoughts and to avoid the repetitive negative thoughts. I mean, you heard the same things I have, which we have something like 70,000 thoughts a day,
Yeah.
90% of which are the same as yesterday. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of grooves that are happening along very familiar neural pathways there. And now we're trying to figure, well, how do I break these up so I can see the world in a different way? Which, by the way, takes a lot of courage too, right?
It does. Yeah, absolutely. And I one thing that I try and impress upon people, because beliefs are usually, well, sometimes we'll believe something despite the facts, but a lot of times our beliefs are those things that we can't necessarily prove one way or another, or we don't have enough information to, so we just develop this belief about something. And so instead of asking yourself, is this belief true? I ask people to consider, is this belief useful? Right? So the
Mm.
utility of our beliefs, I find, is far more important than whether or not it's true, because there are a lot of people who, maybe are very spiritual, and, someone with a very scientific mindset will kind of look down upon that. But those spiritual beliefs are probably very helpful for that person, just as someone who maybe has a very empirical, scientific approach will have beliefs because, well, that's what the empirical evidence says. But we know the placebo effect works, even though there's no scientific, explanation for it. So I really encourage people to look at beliefs in terms of their utility rather than trying to prove whether or not they're right.
So let's get specific here for an entrepreneur who says, you know what, I do want to do this. I want to reframe myself toward happiness. I want to investigate my beliefs. I want to drop the ones that no longer serve me and just pick up the ones that are going to be good for my future here. Like, what's the process that you recommend here, Peter? How do I inventory my beliefs? How do I then? I mean, first, I've got thousands in my head, right?
Yeah.
So how do I start to even articulate these, list them out? Am I scoring them in some way? Or like, what's the process for starting to look at these?
Well, I try and look at the results in my life, or when I have a client, I'll look at sort of the things that are going wrong, because a lot of times when we're faced with challenges, usually we are our own biggest enemy. We cause the most of our own roadblocks, and so when we can look at the outcomes in our life and then trace them back to, what do I believe about that? Is there a belief that I have that is leading to these outcomes? Because if we look at it as belief, and then a strategy that stems from that belief, and that strategy is then leading to actions that lead to results. And if we can, and this goes back to the systemic approach of looking at all the different factors of what's leading to certain outcomes. And if we can backtrack on that and lead that back to certain beliefs, that will really help us. A lot of people come down to it comes down to the same sort of beliefs, and a lot of them are rooted in fear. Right? I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm afraid of failing, and so on. So fear is a great place to start for the negative beliefs that are standing in your way. What am I afraid of? And those are tough things to admit to yourself. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why coaching and therapy, those are a great help. I've done a lot of reading of personal development over the last 25 years. That will get you so far. There's lots of great material out there that helps you, but using a coach or someone else that can really be objective and can ask some of the tough questions you're not willing to ask yourself, that's really important. But there are also habits that they're a daily journaling practice where you can put your thoughts on paper and then read them back and go, okay, does that make a lot of sense to me? That can be really helpful. But everybody is different, and so however you really make the time to reflect, I think that's a big one, especially for entrepreneurs. Always busy, always on the go, and if you don't take the time to reflect and to pause, that's when you'll probably make mistakes. But those are also the same moments where you can look at, okay, what am I unhappy with? How can I lead that back to a belief? And then you can go through that process of changing that belief in those three steps that I talked about, but or some other way or with some other help.
The way that I talk about this, for example, when I was on stage at the Conscious Entrepreneur Summit in June, was the two elements here are courage and commitment, and in terms of getting started. So firstly, I have to have the courage to want to change. Need to have the courage to confront my fears, or to be willing to confront my fears or issues or beliefs, like you're talking about. And then the second part is the commitment, meaning the commitment to go do something about it. So once I have the awareness, okay, I see this is happening. I see this as belief. I am committed to my personal growth. I value my future more than I value whatever I'm bringing with me. And that's the essence of the commitment piece. So that's kind of how I frame those conversations.
Yeah, and why do you need courage? And a lot of times it's because there's some fear in the background. And a lot of times the fear that really affects us is not this imminent fear that we can see coming, but it's usually something that's in the periphery or in the back of our minds. And then it becomes bigger than it actually is. Because when we're willing to confront it head on, it's never as big as our creativity, our imagination make it out to be. And so that's why I think fear is such a fundamental thing that feeds certain beliefs and that keeps us off track. And so that's why you need the courage to face it, because a lot of it is just fear-based, right?
You also talk a fair bit about habits. So like our behaviors are driven by our habits, especially as we get older, right? Not saying I'm old. I'm 48. I still have a lot of life in front of me. But it's true that we are creatures of habit. So I'd love to get your perspective on what are some practical steps, like things that entrepreneurs can do to break out of some of these limiting habits that we're kind of just rolling with. Is it the same thing as beliefs? Are they different? How do we think about that?
I'd like to take a lot of cues from Joe Dispenza on this, because I don't know if you're familiar with his book, Changing the Habit of Being Yourself. And
by the way, I'm a big fan of Joe Dispenza. My wife and I have been to, I think, 4 of his retreats, several week longs, a little weekend intensive here in Boulder, and then one of those advanced follow-up things as well. So we've done plenty for about 5 years now. Yeah.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He doesn't come over to Europe as often, obviously, because he's in the States. But he has great advice. So better than any I could give. So a lot of it just if you look at changing your habits as sort of reinventing yourself every day, I really believe in creating morning rituals or evening rituals or both. And he talks about when you get up, first thing when you wake up, do the mental preparation for who you want to show up as today. And you can simplify that a little bit, because, what's my identity going to be today is a pretty big, it's a pretty big question to ask yourself first thing when you wake up in the morning. But you can, when I look at habit change, there's lots of different theories about it. They talk about, it takes 28 days, or there's different numbers around how long it takes to change a habit. So if you look at if you say it takes a month to change a habit, then how many habits can you change in a year, right? So maximum 12. So and I think that even that is putting yourself under a lot of pressure. But I like to single out habit by habit, what things do I want to change? Because when someone comes to me with a goal that they want to achieve and they want to get coached through it, I look at what kind of behaviors do you need in order to achieve that goal, and that means what do you have to habitualize in your behavior. And so when you single out sort of the first thing that you're going to start with, right? If you're going to run a marathon or whatever, then you have to start a running practice, and maybe part of that running practice is committing to getting up every morning and going for a run. So maybe the first step in that is always having your running gear ready to go, so you don't have any excuses. You can just step into it. So I'm also a big habit of the tiny habits, BJ Fogg's work, where you take small incremental steps, and the more difficult you make the habit to change. Like if you make it this big thing that's going to overwhelm you, you're going to be bound to fail. But if you have something that takes, and this is again BJ Fogg's work, something that takes the least amount of skill and the least amount of effort, then that's going to be the place you start. And then you use triggers in your existing life. So he talks about, he wanted to get fitter, and he started doing a couple of push-ups every time you had to use the washroom. And then then it turned to 10. And so all of a sudden he was doing 100 push-ups a day. So I'd say reducing habits down to their very simple, small parts, and then don't take on too many all at once. So if you recognize there's a habit that you'd like to change, and look at it in a simple form, recognize what triggers it, and then use that prompt to start that new behavior. Again, it takes a lot of awareness, right? So, and it takes also being compassionate with yourself, because the biggest thing that gets in our way is our own self-talk and our inner critic that goes, you'll never, I've never run a marathon, but I know that for a lot of people, the mental part is the hardest part, rather than the obviously it's physically draining, but it gets to that point where you tell yourself, I don't think I can make it. And the same goes for any kind of major change that you want to make in your life. When you try something and then you're just about to break through and then you give up, right?
Yeah, I remember the quote from the David Goggins book where he talks about, all the incredible feats of athleticism and physical prowess that he's performed. And he said at one point something like, when your mind is ready to give up, your body's only 40% done. So the mind can go first unless we're training the mind on how to do this stuff.
Yeah, that man's amazing. The things that he's willed his body to do is incredible.
Yeah. Now, of course, the flip side of this, habit changing or breaking bad habits or getting new ones, developing new ones, is we're pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone, and that's not always good, right? Sometimes big drastic life change may take us too far. It may not be we may not land where we think we're going to land, for example. So I know that you've spoken and written about kind of the dangers of being too drastic in some of these life choices, and then potentially leaving and breaking out of the comfort zone there. What does that actually mean? What are the concerns around that when someone's looking at changing how they're living?
Well, some people, when they decide they're going to make a change, they think they have to go all in. They have to make the commitment, and immediately dive in head first. So I'll draw a circle on a page and say, look, this is your comfort zone, and if you go out here, you're going to be overwhelmed. Fear will take hold of you, and 9 times out of 10 you'll fail, because there's just too much fear and overwhelm that happens. But if you go up to the edge of your comfort zone, and you recognize what your limits are, and then you work on them, and then you expand that comfort zone bit by bit, then you're going to be far more successful. It's just like anything. You build your confidence, and then you become much more difficult to defeat or to get down, even in difficult situations. So just recognize people will talk about their comfort zone, and in terms of where they are right now, but they don't know kind of where the limits of that comfort zone are, right? So how far can I go before I start feeling uncomfortable? And we're all wired to avoid discomfort, but there's when you recognize where that limit is or where that border is, then you can go up to it, push the boundaries, and take it step by step rather than going head first. I never recommend people. Some people they manage it because they by sheer will, because they've cut off all their other options, and so there's no other choice but success. But even people who do that will end up coming back worse off than they were before, and then they're discouraged to ever try again.
And how do we think about integrating happiness into our daily life so that it's just a thing? So we set up all the conditions so that happiness is there. The reason I'm asking about this is, like you, I read a lot of self-help books and personal growth stuff, and so on. And I feel like I have this laundry list of stuff that I need to think about every single day. And the list is out there, and it can kind of get overwhelming, like the number of things that we're so quote unquote supposed to be doing out there to be our optimal selves. Everything from happiness and gratitude and breath work and sleep and exercise and nutrition and mindset and meditation and whatever. The list is very, very long, and sometimes we just want to say, hey, how can I just autopilot some of this, or how can I just create the rules or conditions so that I can just run with it? Does that apply to happiness too?
It certainly does. There are lots of little habits that you can do to make it easier to live a happier life. and I know what you mean, because I could fill my whole day with life hacks and not get
Right.
any work done, because there's so much work done about self-optimization. But in terms of happiness, as I say, it's an inside job. So you do the inner work first. And I go back to the old Stoic philosophers who recognize that the only thing you can really control are your thoughts. And even then, you can't control the thoughts that come and go, but you can control what you put your attention on. So for me, the first step is recognizing what can I control, what can I change, and then am I going to focus on the good stuff, or am I going to focus on the bad stuff? So this is not a recommendation to put your head in the sand and ignore all the bad stuff, but we're wired to see the bad news. We're wired to see all the things that are going wrong and potentially could go wrong. So it's training yourself to start recognizing the things that are going right in balance with the things that are legitimate risks. So people will talk about having a gratitude journal, or it's something I try to do habitually before I go to bed, is just think of a couple of things I'm grateful for, because it primes my mind to wake up in a positive state as well. But there are any number of things. But when you find yourself, a big thing that gets in the way of our happiness is also, we talk about the inner critic, but there's also this habit of complaining that we have. And when we catch ourselves, if there's something that you can't change, and it's one thing to vent one time, but when you find yourself talking about it again and again and again, then you recognize that your inner complainer is really active. And so when you work actively to reduce the amount that you complain, both internally and externally, that's another big sort of hack that you can do. So how you're looking at the world, how you're narrating the life experience, those are some things. And then some really basic things like spending time in nature. You live in a beautiful place in the world, lots of access to nature. There was a study done in Leipzig, Germany a few years ago, where they studied people who lived in very green parts of the city with lots of trees and parks, and people who lived in very sort of stone buildings, streets, not much green. And the correlation they found was in the green areas, the prescriptions for antidepressants were significantly lower than in the other part of the city. So something as simple as taking a walk in a park, or just going outside anywhere green and taking a few breaths. There's simple little things that you can integrate in your day. A lot of times we just don't take the time for those little things that would make us feel so much better. Those 2 minutes in a day that aren't going to make a difference, right? But will, in terms of your productivity, but will make a huge difference in terms of your mental state.
Peter, this is great. We've talked about a lot of these life hacks, as your words, right? Life hacks. We talked a lot about habits and beliefs and shifting and overcoming those. We talked about getting out of our comfort zone. We talked about developing awareness. And I like having these kinds of frameworks and constructs for the listeners here of Conscious Entrepreneur. But I also want to learn more about you and your story. How did this become important for you? What happened in your life that kind of brought you on this journey to say, hey, I want to study this. Hey, I want to learn more about it. Hey, I want to overcome whatever's going on. Give us a taste as we wrap up here. Give us a taste of where you've been along your journey.
Well, it started for me. I was an entrepreneur. My brother and I, we started our own business in Canada, and things were going well. From the outside, people thought, wow, you guys have a great thing going.
What kind of business was it?
It was a craft brewery. Familiar with those?
Oh, yeah, sure. We have a lot of those here in Colorado. Yeah.
So yeah, it was a craft brewery, really fun industry. We were in our 20s, having the time of our life. But in private, I was really depressed. I was really at a point where I didn't know if I wanted to continue. And so those are those points in life when you either decide I'm going to deal with this or I'm going to give up. And so that's when actually the first thing was I had chronic lower back pain, and I went to yoga, and at the end of the yoga session we had did 15 minutes of meditation, and I realized, wow, this is making a difference. So it was a confluence of a number of different events that happened that got me starting to read some self-help books, I started going to therapy. My therapist knew a meditation teacher. I started learning how to meditate, and so it was a whole bunch of things. But it all stemmed from this. The outside world seems great, but and feeling super guilty for how dare I feel unhappy in a situation where other people would be envious to be in, and so that journey really led me to start looking at myself first and foremost, and I realized the biggest change that I made was the things that I believed. So I cast out, the therapy helped me cast out old beliefs, find new ones, and also the way my thinking processes. And so I continued to work on that over the years. And then I eventually ended up walking away from the business. Well, we ended up selling it, but it was a good thing that I departed from. I left Canada, where I grew up. A great city, Vancouver, beautiful city as well. I did some traveling, ended up in Europe, worked in the corporate world, but then I started to learn how to train other people and so on. And so it was this process of the things that I learned from my business and entrepreneurial life and the things that I learned on my personal development journey. I wanted to find a way to give that back to others. And so now I'm at a point where I do leadership training. I coach people, everyone from entrepreneurs to people in leadership, and also private people. And I take the things I've learned, as well as the education I've gotten and my life experience, and I use that in order to help people overcome their own mental roadblocks and their own struggles in life, whether that be personally or professionally. And ideally, I strive to help people find their own highest potential, and whether that's being an entrepreneur or being a parent or whatever. And I think happiness is such a big part of that, because in my opinion, happy people tend to make better decisions. They tend to be better citizens, neighbors, partners in relationships, because that happiness is this feedback that they're on the right track and then they're making the right choices. So that's how it all circles back for me.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. It's helpful to get the perspective to understand where you've been and how you think about this stuff. Well, Peter Teuscher, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.